So this project has been in the works for nearly a year, but in some ways, it's really part and parcel of the long-term work of the university. Duke's rise to prominence as a global university over the past 30 years has been possible only through the movement of people to and from Duke and Durham and other parts of the world. Just as faculty and students come to Duke as immigrants from other nations, faculty and students also conduct research, teach, collaborate across all corners of the globe. At the same time, given our location here in North Carolina and obviously in the United States, Duke has a set of commitments embedded within that. We continue to receive research funding, tax privileges, and other benefits from being a North Carolina and U.S. institution, and there are tensions and opportunities that come from being a global university located in a particular spot in the U.S. And we've devoted an entire panel this afternoon to exploring that. That said, I want to recognize clearly here that immigration is not some abstract topic or principle. I know that many of our students, faculty, and staff experience this issue on a very personal level, either for themselves or for their family and friends. Immigration policy and practice has real impact on their lives and their futures. And by discussing it in an intellectual, conceptual level, while we want to understand all aspects of the issues and options, at the same time, we do not want to lose sight of the real consequences of the topics we'll be discussing on the individual lives of our students, friends, and colleagues. In this respect, the Duke community has come a long way, including a broader range of backgrounds, identities, experiences, and viewpoints than it has before. But we must not be complacent. We must push onward in maintaining the university as a place where people from all over can find their home and can prosper. Every day, the headlines show us how that ethos can be put to the test. And I know it's not always easy, especially when dealing with difficult topics like the ones we'll be addressing today. But I hope you will all lend your voices in a spirit of exchange, sharing, and understanding. As an educational and research institution whose goal is to test orthodoxy and push the boundaries of knowledge, we must be committed to learning and growing together, even when we disagree. Our first instinct must always be to contest ideas with open space for other voices, including traditionally marginalized voices. And I think last night's conversation was a great model of civil discourse and exchange across a range of views. In short, we're committed to knowledge and also to each other, which is consistent with the guiding goals articulated in our own strategic plan, which gave rise to this forum, Together Duke, and also President Price's strategic framework, Duke Will. Living up to these commitments is a daily test for each of us and for our community here at Duke. As Nicholas Kristof's keynote address at noon today will underscore, it's also a test of our values and commitments and communities beyond Duke, in Durham, the U.S., and in the world. It's a hard test and an ongoing one, and our fundamental mission of learning and discovery depends upon us confirming this every day. So thank you all for being part of these important conversations, which I want to note reach beyond today's and sessions. There's a collection of events related to this forum, from student discussions in book clubs to featured lectures and symposia that are being organized across the university, where we all have opportunities to continue the conversation around this pressing topic. I'm looking forward to hearing today, to all that we will learn and discuss, and to further engaging our community and to those beyond in the complex and challenging issues around immigration in a divided world. So thank you all very much. Thanks. I will now introduce our session for today. Our first session, Options for a Fragile World, Immigrants and Refugees in the U.S. and Europe. The conversation is being moderated by Deondra Rose, who is an assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke. Her research focuses on U.S. higher education policy, political behavior, American political development, and the politics of inequality. She is the author of Citizens by Degree, Higher Education Policy and the Changing Gender Dynamics of American Politics, which examines the development of landmark U.S. higher education policies like Title IX and federal financial aid programs, and their impact on the progress that women have made since the mid-20th century. Deondra Rose serves as the Director of Research for the Center for Politics, Leadership, Innovation, and Service, POLIS, here at Duke, and co-director of the North Carolina Scholars Strategy Network. Please welcome Deondra Rose, who will introduce the other participants in the session. Welcome, Deondra.
Thank you very much, Provost Kornbluth, and good morning, everybody. The title of our discussion this morning is Options for a Fragile World. And as we turn to questions of politics and public policy as they relate to immigrants and refugees in the United States and Europe, we'll have the opportunity to build on some of the themes that we touched on in last night's discussion. So the discussion between Professor Suzanne Shanahan, Jose Vargas, and Michael Doherty raised a number of really critical issues in relation to these topics. So they helped us to think really seriously and critically about the very personal nature of immigration and the idea of what it means to have a home and what it means to belong somewhere. They also raised really important and complex questions about immigration and inequality. So we'll build on some of those in today's discussion. So today we're going to think really seriously about how nations, their policymakers, and other political actors grapple with questions of citizenship, national identity, mobility, and the significance and legitimacy of borders. It's a true honor to have the opportunity to join in this discussion with four such amazing thinkers. And I hope that you'll all take part in the discussion. We'll have a question and answer session toward the end. So I'll give you a little bit of a notice for when we're going to bring some microphones up to the front of the auditorium. So we hope that you'll spend some time thinking about your questions and feel free to queue up when the mics arrive. We also hope that you'll join us for a boxed lunch after the session. So I'll introduce our panelists. First, we have Michael Hardt, who teaches political theory in the literature program here at Duke University. He also co-directs Duke's Social Movements Lab. His most recent book, Assembly, which is co-authored by Antonio Negri, addresses the organization and political potential of contemporary leaderless social movements. Since the summer of 2018, Michael has participated in Mediterranea, which is an Italian activist project for migrant aid and rescue in the Mediterranean Sea. He's also a member of the board of directors of the migrant aid nonprofit Saving Humans USA. Next, we have Eric Kaufmann. Eric is a professor and assistant dean of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London. He's the author of a number of books, including White Shift, Immigration, Populism, and the Future of White Majorities. Eric has also authored numerous reports and journal articles focusing on quantitative studies of public opinion and voting. His work has appeared in Newsweek International, Foreign Affairs, New Statesman, and Prospect magazines. It's also been covered in major newspapers and magazines in the United States and the UK. So welcome, Eric. Next, we have Raquel Minian, who's an associate professor in the Department of History at Stanford University. Her first book, Undocumented Lives, The Untold Story of Mexican Migration, explores how unauthorized migration from Mexico to the United States became an entrenched phenomenon in the years between 1965 and 1986. She's also the author of an article titled Indiscriminate and Shameless Sex, which examines the ways in which the United Farm Workers Union used sexual discourse to propagate its labor goals. Anna's second book project, No Man's Land, examines how during the late Cold War and its aftermath, US officials created new spaces and territories designed to prevent Latin American and Spanish-speaking Caribbean migrants from entering the United States. She's also working on a history of immigration detention in the United States. So welcome, Anna. And finally, we have Peter Wehner. Peter is Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's also the Pamela and Jack Egan Visiting Professor at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy and the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences here at Duke. He's the author of numerous books, including The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. He's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and a contributing editor for The Atlantic magazine, and he's appeared as a frequent commentator on MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, CBS, PBS, and C-SPAN television. Peter served in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations prior to becoming Deputy Director of Speechwriting for President George W. Bush. And in 2002, he was asked to head the Office of Strategic Initiatives. Peter has, in addition to all of this, served as an advisor for several presidential campaigns. Welcome, Peter. So to start off, I'm going to turn to each of our panelists to offer a brief opening statement just to share with you their point of departure for coming to this discussion today. So if it's okay, I'll start, Michael, with you.
Sure. So I prepared something to keep it below the time limit. I didn't prepare really to talk about the boat rescue project that Deondra mentioned, but I'm sure we can talk about that. I wanted first really to offer a standpoint or perspective. In my view, neither nationalism nor humanitarianism is an adequate frame for approaching issues of migration. We need instead a standpoint of freedom. The first rule for engaging questions of migration should be to understand migrants not merely as victims in need of charity or protection, but as agents of their own destiny. Humanitarian action, of course, is necessary. Those in distress at sea and in the desert must receive assistance. But the exclusive focus on victimization and violence slips too easily into a humanitarian logic that divides worthy refugees from illegitimate migrants. Many migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean and the US-Mexico borders are indeed fleeing war and persecution and thus squarely fit established refugee criteria. But there are myriad other reasons for flight, which are often mixed together, and many of these appear less noble from a humanitarian perspective. Fleeing the effects of changing climate conditions, attempting to reunite with family and friends, pursuing better employment, running from abusive parents and spouses, exiting failed relationships, or simply seeking adventure. This is why the distinctions between forced and voluntary migration, between refugees and economic migrants, are so unstable and so often criticized by critical migration scholars and migrant aid activists. Once we invert the perspective and adopt the standpoint of migrants, we can recognize that all migrants, regardless of motivation, simply by crossing borders, are engaged in projects of freedom, expressing and exercising the freedom of movement as a fundamental right. And it's amazing how intensely and consistently the word freedom is chanted in a panoply of languages at migrant rallies and demonstrations throughout the world. In addition to striving to limit the violence and to protect migrants from further harm, in addition to offering hospitality, one must affirm the political content of what migrants accomplish. To emphasize this link between migration and freedom, allow me a reference from a very different historical context, which might seem out of place. Thomas Jefferson anticipated today's migrants when he affirmed that the freedom of movement is a universal, inalienable right. Here's Jefferson. He writes, "Departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, and going in quest of new habitations, is a right which nature has given to all men." I know, of course, that despite his universal formulations, Jefferson had primarily in mind white Europeans who had fled Europe for North America, not the enslaved Africans forced in the holds of ships in the Middle Passage, nor the Native Americans displaced and slaughtered, or even non-white populations from other parts of the world, such as Asia. But it's often strategically useful to read Jefferson to the letter, as Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois do, taking his universal claims for true, even when that means going further than he intended. The irrepressible flows of today's migrants across seas, deserts, and borders of all sorts, asserting their right to depart their country of origin in quest of new habitations, as Jefferson said, are affirming everyone's freedom of movement, which is a pillar of all other freedoms. From this point of view, then, the slogan "Refugees Welcome" should of course continue to be affirmed, but it has to be filled with a positive content. Hospitality is a virtuous attitude, but it's not enough. And moreover, it doesn't capture the political potential of our current situation. Rather than merely expressing acceptance of foreigners and willingness to share a limited portion of our social wealth, those in the dominant countries need to recognize migrants as heralds of a new political freedom. Migrants bring various forms of social and cultural wealth, of course, and thus break the monotony and cultural poverty of homogeneous societies. More importantly, in contrast to a society huddled in fear behind walls with militarized defenses, a society that affirms open borders and the right of movement for all is a free society, characterized by public happiness, as the Enlightenment intellectuals like Jefferson would say. North Americans and Europeans must recognize then not only that migrants need their help, but also, and more importantly, that they need the help of migrants to save their own societies.
Thank you. See, Eric?
Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold here, but yeah, so I'm going to, I guess my message here is really to say that we need, that in some ways the perfect can be the enemy of the good, that we need both realism and idealism if we want to address this problem in a satisfactory way. And I guess in a world where the number of people who support, for example, open borders is very small in all countries, I just don't think it's realistic to go for that kind of a prognosis. And the first way in which, for example, a lack of realism can have negative effects might be not to see the impact that offering incentives to people to migrate can have. So if it becomes known that it is possible to move from a poor country to a rich country and to have permanent settlement in a wealthy country, then people quite rationally, and it's something that I think all of us would do, we'd try and take that opportunity. And in fact, some surveys have shown that in Senegal, for example, young men there are willing, 25% of them are willing to take a 50-50 chance on losing their lives to get to Europe. So we have to, I think, be aware of the power of some of these incentives, and to therefore be responsible in the kind of signals we send to prospective migrants. If we're telling them, yes, if you can get a toe on shore, then you can get permanent settlement here, quite rationally, people, whether refugees or not, are going to come in large numbers. In terms also, the lack of realism around public opinion. Again, I mentioned that only a very small share of public opinion supports large-scale open borders. If you are able to convince some elites and work on some legal loopholes in order to get greater access for people, and you don't actually manage to change public opinion in your direction, then what you may be able to get people to arrive, but you will not be able to get governments to pay for safe transport for those migrants from wherever their conflict areas are, which means you run the risk of people being abused en route or losing their lives, as thousands have in the Mediterranean. So it's that partial, not perfect, but partial solution, because you haven't factored in the problem of resistance in the public opinion. I think you have to take a proper measure of public opinion and calibrate your solutions to that public opinion. Third effect of this lack of realism is the rise of populism, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. If we look at Europe, for example, starting in 2013, and this comes from European Union data from Eurostat and the Eurobarometer survey, you can see a very close relationship between increases in refugee arrivals and the rising profile of immigration as a top issue for the electorates of Europe. As that increases, populist party polling starts to rise. So the populist party votes rise on the back of the immigration issue. And I think that, the evidence is incredibly clear. From all the data I've seen, there was a paper that showed in 9 out of 10 West European countries between 2005 and 2016, essentially the rise in immigration numbers led to a rise in populist right vote share. And so I think we've got to be realistic about the kinds of policies that we're advocating. When it comes to refugees, I think our priority has to be saving as many lives as possible, offering a refuge to any number of people who want to come. So that should be the policy priority, not trying to gain permanent settlement for people in a rich country. Yes, we live in an unequal world, but refugee policy is not the way to rectify that cosmic inequality, I believe. Because if we try to smudge the line between offering refuge and offering permanent settlement or citizenship, then I think we imperil actually the first policy goal, which is to offer as many people as possible a refuge from violence. And so I think this is, again, highly problematic. So what's going to happen next time there's a refugee surge? Is Europe going to be open to refugees? Almost certainly not, given what's happened. So we have to sort of be realistic. It's a bit like people's attachments. People are attached to particular others, their families, their friends, their nations, etc. Part of that is just part of the human condition. Our most meaningful, what makes life meaningful is also our particular relationships. If we were forced to be attached equally to every individual on the planet, then we wouldn't have these meaningful relationships. We do have to have obligations to those outside our families, outside our countries, but that's also got to be moderated with particularistic attachments. And again, I use the example, perhaps we can go back, unfortunately, to the tragedy of World War II. And my grandfather escaped from Czechoslovakia in 1938, and that's the only reason I'm here. And that's fantastic. But I think the question is, in devising, it was assumed that essentially if you allowed refugees from Nazi Germany into your country, you were allowing them in as permanent citizens. And I think that what would have been the counterfactual if there had been an arrangement that said, people are going to stay here as long as the war is ongoing, and then they will go home afterwards. I actually think you would have had a much greater willingness in many countries of the world to admit much larger numbers, which could have saved a lot more lives. So I think we have to understand the mix of idealism and realism that is necessary in order to maximize our ability to save lives for people who are fleeing violence and persecution.
Thank you so much, Eric. Anna?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I would like to talk about 3 main points. When I think about immigration, the first thing I also think about is emigration, people who leave. We always talk about points of arrival, but I'm also interested in the points of departure. For example, when you mentioned Senegal and that 50% of people died on the journey, my question was how bad things have to be there. For example, we know that in Guatemala, people are leaving. 12 out of 13 women are assumed to be sexually assaulted as they cross Mexico to reach the United States. And so the Trump rhetoric says, well, maybe we should dissuade them from coming. Don't let them come. That's what has been said. Instead, I would say, how bad are things in Guatemala for them to come? And what is the role of the United States and of the Guatemalan government of creating that? Not just what is our policy towards immigration, but what has been our policy in other countries that has promoted migration and refugees? And also, what is the policies towards migration of the governments from where people are departing? The second thing that I would like to emphasize is how we portray migrants, how we understand migrants. Migrants are either portrayed in the press as heroes, as victims, or as enemies of the state. And actually, migrants are a very complex group of people, full of contradictions, people who often fall in love, do commit crimes. I jaywalk every day. They're complex people like everyone else, and that complexity has been erased, and I think it's very important to understand it. And the third point I would like us to think about is that we think of immigration as static, but there has been a very long historical trajectory, and what we think of, what conservatives think about now in terms of immigration has switched over time. In fact, it was more radical and leftist groups who used to be anti-immigrant, even up to the 1970s. Immigration has really switched, and what has promoted migration and how migration has been viewed has changed dramatically over time. So I think it's very important that we don't see it as static.
Thank you, Anna. Peter?
Thanks. Thanks, Deondra, for hosting us, and to Duke for this forum and for doing a deep dive on an issue of moral urgency and national self-definition. So it's a delight to be here with you and with the fellow panelists. I just want to devote my opening remarks to the issue of refugees and just a couple of specific points on it. The refugee issue, as most of you know, they're in a different category than just immigrants. Refugees are people who are forced from their home countries due to war or genocide or persecution. And this is a bad period in history for that moment. In Syria alone, there are 5.5 million refugees because of that awful civil war that's been going on. And historically, at least in recent history, the United States has led the world for decades in admitting refugees. Indeed, the United States on an annual basis would often welcome in as many refugees as the rest of the world combined. But that's no longer the case. We're no longer leading the world in refugee admissions. And in fact, refugee settlement today is at historic lows. So to give you a context, in the mid-1990s, we allowed in about 115,000, 120,000 a year. I think the last year for the Obama presidency, it was around 68,000. And now, I would say, unsurprisingly, with the Trump era, we're at 18,000. So there's been a huge drop. The reason is because Donald Trump is a person whose political career and rise has been based in part on attacking the other. And usually the other is the most vulnerable people in society, and refugees will often qualify. So I, as a lifelong Republican, at least up until around 3 years ago or so, that bothers me. So with that context, there was a Pew poll that came out earlier this summer that caught my attention that I just wanted to say a couple of words on. And it found that only 25% of white evangelicals say that the U.S. has a responsibility to accept refugees, while people with no religious affiliations were much more likely, 65%, to say that the U.S. had a responsibility to do that. That caught my attention in part because it's a matter of politics and public policy. It also caught my attention because I'm a person of the Christian faith, so I'll get my cards on the table there, and have spent much of my life in evangelical churches. So kudos to Duke for diversity on campus. Evangelical Christian is here. And that does bother me. And the reason it bothers me, I've always been very wary about the idea that you would take what I would think is a biblical ethic and try and apply it in a simplistic and I think rigid way to public policy issues. That's hard to do. I've worked in 3 administrations. Public policy is a complicated matter. It's a matter of prudence and wisdom. You're often having to make difficult decisions on incomplete information in a limited period of time. And yet there are a lot of factors that you have to take into account to try and compromise and all the rest. But I do think that it is fair to say, from a Christian perspective, that this issue is pretty clear in terms of the ethic of it. And I'm not going to give you a sermon, but I'm just going to quote a couple of verses that I think bear on this, and that's both true in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. In Leviticus, it says, "The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the foreigner as yourself, for you are foreign in the land of Egypt, and I am the Lord your God." And in Jeremiah, "Thus saith the Lord, do justice and righteousness, and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed, and do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, the widow, nor shed innocent blood in his place." And in the New Testament, Jesus, "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." And probably certainly one of the most famous parables in the New Testament is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I think that matters. And I think something has gone deeply wrong. In the chapter of the book that Deondra mentioned, I have a chapter on faith and politics, and my bottom line is I think faith can be both a force for good and a force for evil in politics, and history is full, replete, including American history, of examples of both. I want it to be a force for good, and I do think that this matters in the context of this discussion, because I do think people in the community of faith have actually done a lot of good in their individual lives, churches to help people, refugees, and others. And this is an area that we have to attend to. And more broadly, I would hope that people of faith would be, as a general matter in politics, agents of compassion, solidarity, healing, and reconciliation, because we're a land that is in need of all of those things. And today, with so much wrong in American politics, I would submit that politics, among other things, is disfiguring faith in ways that I find troubling and in need of repair.
Thank you so much, Peter. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes when we talk about immigration, we focus particularly on what to do once people have decided to migrate. I wonder if we can step back a little bit and talk about some of the political forces and maybe even policy forces that cause migration or cause people to decide to leave home in the first place. So I'm wondering, are there any factors that tend to get the most attention in our discussions when we take seriously the forces that drive people to leave home? And are there any things that we're leaving out of these discussions? Anna, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So in the United States, we generally portray migrants as simply being desirous of coming to the United States without thinking of the causes that have propelled their migration. But in fact, Mexican migration really started to increase when labor contractors asked Mexicans to move to the United States to work here. In 1942, as the Second World War was taking place, the US government went to the Mexican government and asked it to send men to come north and work here for short periods of time as guest workers. The program lasted from 1942 to 1964. And it was during this period that Mexicans were encouraged to come, both by their own government and by the US government, that they developed a culture of migration. So for example, when you talk about how if we could develop just short-term migration, if people would be okay with that, what I first think about is the Bracero program. Because once a culture of migration is created, people don't just want to stay, don't want to come, work, have no rights, not belong in the society in which they live, and then just leave. They keep coming. They create attachments, of course. And so one of the big reasons why Mexicans have been coming for such a long time is because of recruitment by the United States to come here. And the other factor that has propelled it is the economic policies that the Mexican government instituted, which were policies that did not try to get people to stay within their own country, but sort of favored migration as a way of alleviating surplus, like a surplus number of people and increasing unemployment. So I do think that the policies of people's home countries, the policies of the governments of people's home countries, and the policies of the country to which they're going are very important when seeing the conditions that propel migration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say, oh, sorry, you go.
No,
I'm just going to say briefly about just the migration studies field where if we look quantitatively at what are the correlates of countries that send migrants, it's not the poorest countries or the richest, it's actually those that are kind of in the middle where you have enough money now that you can afford to finance what is actually quite an expensive process of getting to particularly a rich country. So as countries move up the development ladder, now Mexico's at a stage of income where they're no longer sending large numbers of people, but it's also not the very poorest. So there are a number of countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where you can see that in the future, as if they're able to move up the economics curve, that'll actually lead to more migration from those countries. Also, it's worth saying that there is a diaspora effect where once a diaspora arrives in a country, they can then lower transaction and information costs for subsequent migration. So you can actually get a certain self-reinforcing effect. And so the size of a diaspora in a particular country will correlate with the number of migrants coming from a particular country as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say quickly, Anna's exactly right. There's been some recruitment that's gone on in this country to bring people in, and it's worked. So that's one factor. So as I was talking about earlier, refugees is another factor. People under desperate situations, life-threatening situations coming. I wouldn't undersell at the same time the idea that America is a land of opportunity. That's still very real for some immigrants that come to this country who see it as a place of economic opportunity, but also political freedom. So it's a combination of factors that draw people in, as is the case in most instances. I'll just say as a matter of public policy, I think that those distinctions are important because I think too often what happens is we just collapse these things and make sweeping generalizations and try and pass public policies based on false realities. And you have to take into account what it is that you're dealing with. And just one other point, which is I do think that the country has a responsibility, if they've engaged in recruitment to bring people over, Then all of a sudden to say, well, now we're changing the rules in mid-game. So we've invited you in, and now all of a sudden you're enemies of the state is not right. And you have to take that into account. Now that doesn't tell you particularly how to deal with it. And immigration policy has to be based on a whole series of factors. Sovereign nations have to determine how many people are going to bring in, what kind of people are going to bring in, what the criteria is, and all the rest. But I do think that in the matter of fairness and just the reality of things, if you've invited people to be in, and then you say all of a sudden, how the heck did you get here? And out you go. That isn't right.
So thinking seriously about, once someone makes the decision to migrate, I'm really curious about what that process looks like. And Michael, you have unique insight into, what some people face as they attempt to migrate as refugees. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your project in the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah, and I have some insight. And so I've been for the last year and a half part of an Italian activist project, a rescue boat for migrants in the Mediterranean. Essentially, which started once that the Italian government tried to close down all humanitarian efforts in the Mediterranean and make them illegal. All NGOs were like Médecins Sans Frontières or were closed down. So we started an activist project, starting a migrant rescue boat. I, though, haven't been on the boat. I've been here teaching at Duke. And in fact, the way the boat works, there are few activists who can be on the boat. There's a professional crew, a small number of activists. But we do, one of the things that does seem to me important about this, and it's, Anna said that migrants are complicated. You can't, I think, from my perspective, it's a danger in the question about the causes of migration that one quickly divides legitimate from illegitimate migrants. And I think it's, from my perspective, it's important to recognize and honor and even support the various reasons for migration, and not separate out, as the European and U.S. Official policies do, between legitimate refugees and illegitimate migrants. So I think, they're complicated. That's what one finds. They don't fit neatly into various categories. Also, just working with migrants directly, quite reasonably in these interview structures, they seldom tell the truth, or tell what they think needs to be heard, even if they have various experiences. So I don't know. That's why I would just I would question myself, or I've found often that going down that road of trying to even legitimate migration by saying, look, there are real causes, there's war, et cetera, then you end up dividing the migrants into two groups, which seems to me detrimental.
So may I ask a connected question?
Yeah.
What do you think are the common or the most commonly held misperceptions about migrants? And for anyone.
Yeah.
I don't really.
Go ahead, Anna. Yeah, you.
Well, I do agree with you about the refugees versus migrants. Especially, I work primarily on Mexican migration, and one of the, let's start, like you said, one of the first misconceptions is that Mexican migration is going up. Since 2008, we have negative net migration from Mexico, so that's a huge misconception. And I do think that this distinction between refugee and migrant, which I know you believe in, for me, it is a bit of a misconception. Let's think about Mexican migrants. First, just the definition of refugee as political refugee, of course, ignores the possibility that economic refugee could also be a refugee category. But also, when we always think about Mexicans simply as migrants and not as refugees, we also forget the violence that exists in Mexico. Nowadays, a lot of people are fleeing violence, not economics. But because they have already been categorized as migrants and not as refugees, they're not being recategorized. So I do think that this is a problematic category and distinction, because people often leave for multiple reasons.
Mm-hmm.
No, I just wanted to clarify, I'm certainly not in favor of simplistic categorizations, but I do think, as a matter, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, as a matter of public policy, one has to make distinctions on who can come in and who can't come in. There's a finite number that comes in, and the country and policymakers have to say, what's the criteria that we use? And and then a whole series of factors goes into that. And some of it is going to be, what are the conditions of the people leaving? And do you take into account a humanitarian perspective, which is certainly a legitimate one to do? So the United States has an obligation as a country that's blessed with certain wealth and so forth to take in. Then there's the issue of what are the conditions of the country and the citizens in the country and what's needed there. What is the number of people that we take in? How do we determine that? So, you know, when all is said and done as a matter of public policy, categorizations do have to be made. And I think you're right. I think it's too easy to say, if you're talking about Mexican migrants, well, they're coming for this reason, and having this simplistic or imaginary reason to explain all of that versus political refugees. But at the same time, there are people who are fleeing places like Syria that are facing the kind of horrors that a lot of other people aren't.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do countries have a responsibility to defend their borders?
Well, I think they absolutely have a responsibility. I think maybe this gets to some of the philosophical differences that exist in this debate. So one of which is, do we owe the same obligations to everybody in the world that we do to our fellow nationals? The thing about a nation is it's we pay whatever 40%, I don't know, depending on the country. I live in Britain, might be 50% in tax, and that gets spent on our fellow nationals, roads, schools, welfare assistance. We spend that amount of our money on our fellow nationals because we care about them in some sense more than people who are not our fellow nationals, or just as we spend more on our families and children than we do on strangers. And I just don't think you're going to be able to get to a world where you, again, have the same attachment to everybody regardless of whether they're a family member or a member of your fellow nation. I mean, a nation it's important in terms of being able to have a functioning democracy. So if your side loses an election, you accept, I know this is a bit of an issue in the US, but you kind of accept a transfer of power to the other party. And if you're asked,
at least we used to.
Yeah, if you're, I know that's fraying here, but that, this is partly underpinned by this notion that you share something in common, and therefore you're willing to give and take in that way, and also to share wealth. So I think once you say we don't have a border, you then you imperil that entire social contract which underpins that sort of democracy and that willingness to share wealth. And I just think it's just not what the electorate, not all of the electorate, but what most of the electorates want. And I just think for us to circumvent democracy, I would only want to circumvent democracy if it was about saving large numbers of lives, not if it's just about giving people in what is a very unequal world access to a rich country. So that's the difference.
Well, I have a bit of a different view because borders have seemed to collapse for trade, for example. So just as international economic trade has expanded, the movement of people has been more and more regulated. And part of what this has done is the expansion of trade. For example, if we think about NAFTA in 1994, NAFTA allowed for free trade between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. This free trade often harmed communities of high out-migration in Mexico. But just as this new free trade was harming those communities, the border became increasingly militarized. So we're having a contradiction of the very meaning of borders and what borders are allowed to go through and what borders don't allow to go through.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have two separate things. I mean, one is I'm not quite as, I don't have as much invested in the homogeneity of some national belonging. I remember being struck at a certain point, this is maybe 20 years ago, by graffiti in Paris, written in French, said, "Foreigners, please don't leave us alone here with the French." And the idea, I think of, I think that there's I was going to say danger or sadness, I'm not sure we're at the right one, about societies that erect walls to protect certain homogeneous populations. That seems to me a problem. I mean, the other one, here I feel like I'm the Thomas Jefferson representative for the morning. It seems to me, it's another quote from Jefferson, where a less noble one of his, where he says, we have the wolf by the ears and we can't hold him and we can't let him go. What Jefferson was referring to there was slavery. He said, he thought it's right to abolish slavery, but it's impractical. It's unreasonable. You'll have the backlash of the white Southerners. Actually, the state doesn't have enough money to compensate all those slave owners for all the property you're taking away from them. Seems to me that in instances like this, it's not just a matter of practicality. I mean, or so one way of thinking about it, you could say, sometimes you have to do the right thing and then figure out how to work it out. The second way of saying this is sometimes the only reasonable thing is to demand the impossible. I mean, I think that's what, and so I think what I would rather address the question from the perspective also of the migrants about what kind of society we want and and the justice of it, and then figure out the practicalities of it, rather than just say this doesn't seem practical because of public opinion or some other factors. I mean, one has to take those into account, but I think that they come second rather than first.
Mm-hmm. So, an interesting. So I read some of your work where you describe your activism as civil obedience as opposed to civil disobedience, in that you engage in the rescue of refugees within the letter of the law, of international law. And so I'm really curious, as we talk about borders, as we talk about how policymakers and people operating outside of positions as elected officials or political elites engage in this particular area of politics. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the law, to what extent do you think the law ought to be respected, even if it's not necessarily, to your mind, perfect law or effective law?
I can talk about the specific case, but I think you guys will have different things. With this boat rescue project in the Mediterranean, it's somewhat complicated because at sea there are overlapping juridical structures. There's national law, there's European law, there's international law, there's the law of the sea, and this traditional law of the sea says, and this is also inscribed in international law, that any people in distress at sea have to be not only rescued, that's your obligation. If you come across people at sea in distress, it's your obligation to not only rescue them, but take them to a safe port. The international community has designated Libya not a safe port. So returning migrants to Libya, where there are both essentially concentration camps for migrants, civil war, et cetera, isn't an option. So it's obeying the law. This is what the Italian government, other European governments have refused to do recently. It's only obeying the law to rescue migrants who are in distress at sea and bring them to a safe port. It's in some ways a joke because or it feels funny because the group the Italian activist group that I'm engaged with this project and people I've engaged with a long time, we're used to doing civil disobedience. Like that's what we normally have done, saying that disobeying an unjust law is the right thing to do. This is a long tradition of that, as of course you know. It seems ironic in this case that we're actually the ones obeying the law and the states are the ones violating the law. And so it seemed like an ironic shift of, but one might say a similar kind of thing. It's somewhat different because it's not at sea, about migrant aid at the Arizona border. Like groups like No More Deaths who try to leave water or leave things so that people don't die in the desert. There's some ways in which, even though they're different jurisdictional struggles, that seems like a similar kind of civil obedience to me rather than civil disobedience, even if Border Patrol is arresting and trying to prosecute them.
Mm-hmm. Think about the rule of law in the discussion of immigration and migration generally.
Sorry, the rule of law?
The rule of law.
Yeah, or just how we're thinking about laws and the legitimacy of law.
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of these questions are getting down to the issue of democracy and national, which is national. And therefore, if you are going to say we're going to try and interpret things outside of that and circumvent what is the popular will in a country, I mean, I think that's problematic, I suppose. I think that you can try and change public opinion, absolutely. Try and soften public opinion to your position, but to try and sort of and I'm certainly supportive of what you're doing in terms of rescuing people at sea. I'm not talking about that, but what I am talking about is loopholes that would allow people to not be deported, for example, and essentially allow people in outside of some sort of democratic process. So what that I think it actually does is it tends to increase support for populism. And if we look at public opinion, again, you can look at Europe, it's very clear in Germany, monthly refugee arrivals significantly correlated with rising AfD support. And that's just one example. And so we can get to a situation where you are going to harden public opinion against refugees by going, it's what is seen as circumventing, either through some sort of international norms which go against those kind of national democratic interpretations. And I just think that the better path would be to work on public opinion in the democracies and get legislative change in the direction that you want. The other thing I should say, however, is the context for this is that we, according to the Gallup World Poll, something like 700 million people would like to emigrate to Western countries, and there are 60 million refugees in the world. If you are going to talk about essentially rolling out a welcome mat, you're going to get numbers many orders of magnitude higher than we have. And if we think populism is at a high ebb right now, it's only going to get, the amplitude's only going to get greater. So I just don't know what. We can talk philosophically or we can talk practically. I don't think you can take the practical out of this. I think, but by all means try and change public opinion, but I think you have to factor in the practical or you run the risk of essentially making refugee admission almost, virtually impossible in many countries.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in on a couple of those points. I think Eric is right. I don't think morality is not driven by public opinion. That's a mistake, and majoritarian rule is not. We had this debate in the 1850s and 60s between Lincoln and Douglas about that, and Lincoln was right. You don't say on every issue vote it up or vote it down. Those are certain unalienable rights. At the same time, there is the ethic of responsibility, and statesmen and policymakers have to think through not just what is practical in terms of public opinion, but what the radiating effects of what you do is. And if you make mistakes on issues of migration, refugees, and all of the rest, and this causes tremendous collateral damage and a blowback, which we're seeing across the Western world. And if that's the conditions, then you've got to think, is the policy that I'm going to implement going to be pouring kerosene on this fire? So you have to think through if you think that this fire that's raging, as I do, throughout much of the Western world needs to be calmed down, you have to figure out how to do that. Just more broadly, I don't think that borders are unjust inherently, and I don't think an international law doesn't recognize that. That nations have to have borders, and they have to have laws to govern their populace. That doesn't tell you per se what you have to do. But I just don't think you can say, if you have 5.5 million refugees from Syria and they all decide they want to go to Germany, does Germany have a moral obligation to take all of them, or some of them, or how many of them, in what period of time? And if one says, look, well, borders are unjust, or that's not fair, or every refugee that wants to go to a country should have the right to do it, that creates real problems. That's the complexity of life. That's the complexity of politics and public policy, which is try to balance those issues prudentially. Just one last thing on the rule of law and how important it is. I mean, obviously, it's vital. You've got to have a rule of law. Law is the expression of certain moral sentiments, and if you have a lawless country, you have anarchy and you have problems. But laws can be wrong. Right? So if you want to read at least the best document that I know in American history, it's Martin Luther King from a letter from a Birmingham City jail where he talks about just and unjust laws and talks about the obligations that people have to follow just laws, but not unjust laws. And then the question becomes, if you are a person that's facing an unjust law, how do you deal with that with integrity as well? So as a general matter, laws matter. We should respect them, and there should be penalties for people who don't who don't follow them. But sometimes the people who pass laws are wrong, and people of conscience have to stand up against that. And where you fall on those issues is where people who are honorable and intelligent will often debate and disagree.
So I'm really curious, based on your expertise, your various knowledge and experiences, if you had the opportunity to advise a particular elected official on the issue of either immigration or refugee policy, who would you select and what would you say?
That's a hard one.
It's hard. Well, I mean, okay. Again, just in keeping with my earlier remarks about refuge and settlement, I sort of am of the view that you can look at two countries in Africa, Kenya and Tanzania. Kenya and Tanzania, when they received sort of numbers in the sort of thousands or tens of thousands, they could admit them with free movement into the country. They could settle where they liked and more or less become citizens. Once the numbers started to reach into the hundreds of thousands, what you see in those countries is they say, well, the numbers are now getting to a level where we're going to create camps and we're going to create facilities. You can still come here and be safe, and they were able to get money internationally for these camps, but you're not going to have the right to simply have free movement within the country and a path to citizenship. And I kind of think a lot of this depends on numbers. I mean, if the numbers remain modest, then you can have paths to citizenship and settlement. But if the numbers are what we saw, with the Syrian conflict, then I do think that camps or some sort of solution that is temporary, where people are able to have education and medicine and food, and also work, by the way, and earn money. I think that's important if possible. It's not the same as having settling permanently and making a new life. But I don't think we owe, I think to say that we owe all the people who are in poor countries a new life in the West is just completely unworkable. But I think we do owe, however many number, passage to safety and to these amenities. And so I've kind of, one possibility might be to have, and which the European Union has been exploring, is exactly what Kenya and Tanzania have done, which is to create facilities. And I think having them in Europe or in a Western country would not be a problem. I think we have to ask, and again, this is to commit the resources, because a lot of the opposition to refugees is coming from people saying they are now, joining part of our nation in very large numbers, and we're uncomfortable with that. But I do think people would be more willing to share, to pay, to understand they have an obligation, and not just the Western countries, but the countries that duck out of all refugee obligations in East Asia and the Persian Gulf and so on, who are rich countries. So we could get if we had a system of these temporary facilities, we could absorb very large numbers for as long as it takes for then things to calm down in their home country and go back, And I think that is a solution, because it also disincentivizes people who just want to come for settlement. So only the people who really need to be there will be there. I would like to see that looked at, but it is being looked at now in Europe. But it's something that I think we should consider.
Thank you.
I'll be happy to go next. I'll be less diplomatic. I would speak to, I guess, President Trump. Not that he would listen to me. I try and speak to him in my various writing forms. But I would say several things. The first thing is, I would say, or I would hope he would take into account, stop attacking the other because you are perpetrating a malicious myth. That he's creating these lies for political purposes and creating a false picture of what migrants are, and it's wrong, and it's hurting people. I think he should change the policy in terms of the approach toward immigrants and refugees as well. And beyond that, I think a president has a certain obligation to try and unify the country, not to divide it. I think that on some level, well, I'm certain on some that he doesn't understand the contributions that immigrants make It's an odd thing because if you went back to the history of Lincoln and the history of Reagan, two Republicans from a very, very different view and attitude about what immigrants contribute to the United States. And if you read some of Ronald Reagan's speeches, you see him talking about the miracle of diversity to this country, people bringing in different customs, different languages, different backgrounds, and how much that contributes to the country. Because in America, when it's worked best, it somehow coheres, that somehow out of this diversity, out of many, come one, in a sense of one nation. And Donald Trump is a person that's totally outside of that stream of thought and philosophy. But more broadly, he's a person who seems to take a psychic delight in dividing people and stoking the flames of anger and animosity and hatred. And he's succeeding in that. And the country right now is deeply fractured and divided and angry. There's a lot of antipathy. For reasons that predate Donald Trump and are complicated. It's a polarized country, more polarized than it's been for a whole series of reasons. But he's a terrible accelerant to all of those things, and immigration is just one way that he does it. But it's probably the most predictable way that he does it, because if you went through the 2016 campaign, every time he got in a jam politically, that's the card he played, whether it was saying put an end to all Muslim immigrants, or his famous comments when it came down the escalator on his announcement. So this is a difficult time, and the president matters. He's got a bigger bullhorn than anybody else, and there's collateral damage from him.
Thank you.
Well, I would talk to pretty much anyone who's willing to hear me, including all of you. It was me, maybe. But the main point I would try to emphasize to politicians is to think beyond immigration. Immigration is an issue that is not restricted to immigration. So, for example, if we think about wages, like the common argument is like, oh, but immigrants are going to come and lower the wages. I actually think that instead of trying to regulate immigration, we should look towards the Department of Labor rather than Homeland Security and think about, well, let's establish a proper minimum wage and make sure that it's regulated. Like, why are we not thinking more in terms of defending labor than in terms of preventing immigrants? And similar in terms of thinking more broadly about immigration is not just about what happens once migrants arrive here, but as I've been saying, why do they leave? And so what is our economic policy in other countries and our political foreign policies that sort of promote migration, and how can those policies instead be used to promote safe conditions and proper economic conditions so that people don't have to migrate?
Mm-hmm. May I tag a question on for you, Anna? As an historian, do you think that policymakers factor history into their thoughts about immigration and refugee policy enough?
Absolutely not. And I think the most clear aspect of that is this idea of now the wall. In 1986, the US Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And part of what that did was it increased the fortification of the US-Mexico border. Before 1986, Mexican migrants used to be circular migrants. So actually, most of them would come and then leave. They did not intend to stay. And what fortifying the border did was that as migrants came, because their home condition was still pretty bad, they no longer left, because they knew that if they wanted to come back, they wouldn't be able to. So actually what fortification of the border has done is increase the number of immigrants living in the United States. And still, politicians use border fortification as the rhetoric of reducing migration.
Thank you.
I was just going to put the two of you together. Maybe this is just the joke response, that you do the Reagan moment to Trump, say, Mr. Trump, tear down this wall.
I like that. It's good.
That would be, yeah. That's all. Just a joke. That's.
So can we go back a little bit and think about how the parties in the U.S. have historically dealt with, or the positions that they've historically taken toward immigration? I wonder, Anna and Peter, can we turn to you for just a little bit of additional context here? Because I think this is fascinating.
You want to go first?
Sure. So I actually find it fascinating how positions have switched. Generally, we think about conservatives as being the group that opposes migrants. But up until the 1970s, it was labor unions, particularly the AFL-CIO, that was the main lobbyist against immigrants. And in fact, farmers, growers, employers wanted immigrants. So they actually promoted undocumented migration, wanted the Bracero program, wanted more immigrants. And it's not until the 1980s with President Reagan that we see a switch because of a new discourse on law and order and protecting our borders. Again, when we think about the border and whether it needs to be protected, before the 1980s, people were not thinking about the border. If anything, they were thinking about internal regulations of immigration. So in the 1980s, Chicano groups start to pressure labor groups, and labor groups realize, look, we're not going to survive if we don't start including immigrants in our base. So unions, the AFL, start to switch and become more pro-immigrant, while conservative groups start to adopt a more law and order, protect our borders type of discourse. And we have a huge switch from the left to the right as to who supports and who opposes immigrants.
Yeah, I just add to that. I think it's right that about protecting the borders, but I think that the attitude of, let me speak here, of the Republican Party has just changed dramatically from this era with Trump and the era that came before it. I actually had jotted down, I'm just going to read you a few sentences from a Reagan speech, just to give you a sense of the flavor of how much this has dramatically changed. We have a statue in New York Harbor of a woman holding a torch of welcome to those who enter our country to become Americans. She has greeted millions upon millions of immigrants to our country. She welcomes them still. She represents our open door. All the immigrants who came to us brought their own music, literature, customs, and ideas. And the marvelous things, a thing which we're proud, is that they did not have to relinquish these things in order to fit in. In fact, what they brought to America became America, and this diversity enriched us. It has literally shaped us. That's just a very, very different way of viewing things. And Reagan's final speech, actually, his final Oval Office speech, was a tribute to immigrants. And if you go back, for example, and watch some of the debates between George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan in 1980, when they were primary challengers, it was a debate actually in Houston, and they're kind of falling over themselves in terms of essentially welcoming and being generous toward undocumented workers from coming in. I worked in the Reagan administration. I worked in the George W. Bush White House for 7 years. He ran in 2000 saying family values don't stop at the Rio Grande. He was very sympathetic. He was a governor in Texas toward migrants. In general, he actually won 40% of the Latino vote in 2004. And even if you read the entire sort of conservative media complex, which now is one of the things that's driving the anger and antipathy toward immigrants, legal and undocumented, they were all on board. I mean, they were shaped very much by the Reagan philosophy. So you didn't see people like Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, and you can go through the entire. They were not complaining about undocumented workers, illegal immigration, and so forth. So something deep and profound has happened. In my view, it's not conservatism; it's a sort of angry populism, which is a very, very, very different kind of thing. And as I mentioned earlier, Lincoln was the first great Republican, essentially the founder of the Republican Party, and his views on this matter are fundamentally different than what we have in the White House today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know. I think the picture's more complex than it's being made out to be here historically. In the U.S. case, for example, I don't think it's absolutely correct to say organized labor was anti-immigration through most of U.S. history. And it's also correct to say, I think that large business has been pro-immigration through pretty well all of U.S. history. But if we take the broader label of conservative and liberal, that's just not the case in the sense that You have on the left side, or the liberal side, you have a sort of more culturalist left, which has historically been pro-immigration going back certainly to the early 20th century with the liberal progressives. And then on the conservative side, I mean, clearly the Republican Party was the party of restriction. If you go to, again, the early 20th century, it was the northern Protestant vote, and it was restrictionist. Yes, big business, to the extent it was part of the Republican coalition, would have been a force for pro-immigration. But I think these are much longer traditions. I don't think it's something that has happened very recently. And I think while it is true that the Republican Party was pro-immigration under Reagan and the Bushes, I think there was always another current there, which was perhaps subdued, but expressed periodically, as in Proposition 187 in California. So I just wouldn't want to sort of say that this is not at all connected to party and ideology, because I think there are these larger historical connections. And by the way, historically in other parts of the world, like in Scotland and Canada, when you've had large-scale migration of particularly groups of a different religion, so Catholics into Protestant Scotland, you've had the same populism that we see today. So I think it would be more surprising not to see it than to see it by the standards of world history, certainly modern world history. Yeah.
I just, one thing to add to that, but this would be both thinking about the US and Europe, is that we haven't yet talked about the connections between migration and racism. And it seems to me it's profoundly connected. And so both in the US, and so I think you're right about talking about these various traditions, and part of the segment you're talking about in conservatism is really a racist formation, at least part of it. In Europe, certainly today, I mean, I think that's the way one has to read anti-migrant sentiment as, and so the relationship between policies about migration and the rise of racism, both against migrant populations and against other populations. So I think that one has to think about those two together, both in US history and in the current European situation.
I'd love to stay here for just a moment and think about the extent to which race is woven into various national identities. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and how that plays into all of this.
Yeah, I guess I would take a broader view than race and call it ethnicity rather than race, in the sense that, a group might look the same, but might have a different religion or a different language. And it's that sort of injection of, if you like, ethnic difference, or the changing ethnic composition that is, I think, the significant thing. That could, yes, race could be a part of that, absolutely, is a part of that. So yes, I would agree with you on that this is part of what unsettles identities. But I think that there's a very important distinction to be made between racism, as in, so Trump, when he talks about Mexicans and Muslims in a pejorative way, I would call that racism. But on the other hand, if you are saying we want to slow down the ethnic change in the country, I would not call that racism. If it's based
Why not?
Okay, all right. Because I guess I would define racism as essentially feeling superior or hating another group, or wanting some kind of race purity in your country. Purity, absolutely. But if it's a question of not should we be open or closed, but how fast should we move? Not should we be monocultural ethno-state, Richard Spencer, or totally multicultural, but like, I don't know, Hawaii or Mauritius or a deeply multiracial country. But if the question is how multicultural, I think that's a legitimate debate to have, right? So it's, as long as it's about attachment to own group and attachment to sort of a way of life, etc., that doesn't mean that you get your way entirely. It means you have to compromise with the people who want faster change. I think that's a reasonable debate to have. Question of speed. It's not, are we going to be closed, but some people want it faster, some want it slower. And I think that's absolutely the issue, by the way. And if we look at the voting for populist right parties, it's really not about economics. It's very little about people. Actually, even pressure on jobs and public services is not the main driver. It is these questions of identity. So I think, yeah, it's absolutely relevant. But I would like to be more forensic in picking on what is racism and what is more cultural conservatism, which I think we need a space to be able to talk about cultural conservatism as distinct from, feeling superior to another group, and what is the rate of, we're going to have change, we're absolutely going to have more diversity, et cetera, but the pace, I think, is a legitimate discussion.
Thank you.
And I'll just add to that, which is if that distinction isn't made, then you're going to have a powder keg, and you're going to have, if the idea that there are people who are concerned about the culture changing too quickly, which in some cases I think can be legitimate, in some cases may be illegitimate, but if the racist branding iron is brought out and that's what's told to them, this creates a tremendous backlash, and people feel like that if even somebody like Bob Putnam, who's hardly a racist or a conservative, says that if in the short run, immigration and ethnic diversity tends to reduce social solidarity. That's what happens throughout history. That doesn't mean that people who feel that happening are racist. They could feel vulnerable, and maybe they need help to get through that. But if all those people who have concerns, because if you have unusually high numbers of immigration, including immigration, and historically that creates tensions and uncertainty and vulnerability, and you start saying, well, these people are racist, we're seeing this now in the Western world, which is they're going to say, screw you, and then you're really going to get a blowback.
At least we should make a distinction here between, one, I think you're making two arguments, and one I would agree with and one I wouldn't. One is to say that there's reasonable questions about change and we should actually focus on that. The other is to say that because there will be backlash, one is really blaming those who are arguing for change for the backlash. Like, so you would say, oh, well, we shouldn't give women rights because there's going to be backlash.
No, I'm not.
And then, of course, there is.
I'm not.
There will be.
I'm not saying that you don't do it because of the backlash.
Yeah.
I'm saying that you shouldn't do it in that it's inappropriate, and if you do it inappropriately, there will be a backlash. So there you get the worst of all worlds, which is you're branding people who aren't racist. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, when you do that, you're going to actually give power to people who are racist, and you're going to create a kind of cultural division. I'm just saying that you have to be careful about it. I'm not arguing that there aren't racist elements in this country. I'm not arguing that Donald Trump isn't appealing to them. I'm a lifelong Republican who's said it probably publicly more than anybody on this panel, I'll at least say that. So I don't deny that. But I also know people in my own life who have a different view of immigration than I do. And they're not in the least racist. They're concerned. They believe that there is a kind of social cohesion that a country has, and that at some point immigration can begin to tip the scale, and that there are human costs to that. And I have discussions with them, and I disagree with them, but that's just in an entirely different category.
I just don't understand how we can think of social cohesion and who we are without thinking not in terms of superiority. You were saying like, oh, no, we want to be the same. They are others, but that already implies like they are others and worse. That's why we don't want them. And second, I would wonder where we assume that ideas of race, again, have been static, but I wonder where they come from. And when you separate it from economics, I don't think it's that useful. I think, in general, a lot of the fear comes around this idea of like they're going to disrupt us, they're going to disrupt our economic levels. But I do think we're moving toward, like you said, a more openly racist sort of ideology. Sort of, we went from calling Mexicans "quote unquote" wetbacks to calling them illegal aliens, where it was like, oh, it's not about race, it's about their legality. To now again just saying it's about race. So it has become a more openly racist discourse, even while it was always racist. But I do think that this idea of like they are different from us is racist and should be called so.
Yeah, I guess I would disagree with that. I don't think it's particularly distinct from, if you take African Americans in Harlem, if Harlem is becoming less African American and people are lamenting that and wanting to slow it down, I don't see that as racism, and I don't see this as racism. It's racist if you say we want a perfectly 100% white society, or you want to stop change altogether. I think once you start to say that wanting to protect particularity is somehow racist, I think you're stretching the meaning of racism. And that's sort of getting to what Peter was saying. That then has blowback effects. By the way, we have a number of psychological studies that show that when you use the term racist to describe a policy and then you remove it, putting that term racism in actually substantially increases support for Donald Trump, for very conservative policies. So this is actually an established blowback effect. It's not just something we're talking about that's abstract. The other thing I think is worth saying is, look, a lot of this is rooted in psychology now. Increasingly, the literature shows that half of this is heritable in terms of whether you see change as exciting or as loss, whether you see difference as disorder or as interesting and stimulating. And that gets down to people's internal psychological dispositions. And we've got very strong data on all of this stuff. Happy to talk to people about it. But part of this is recognizing that people are wired differently. They're going to approach change differently. We need to have a space for accommodating in the middle between the people who are wired one way or the other. I think if we kind of say that, no, we can teach everybody to love diversity and change, I think we're really kidding ourselves. And there's a work by Karen Stenner on the authoritarian dynamic, which is quite good on this, which shows that, in fact, you get these blowback effects. So I think we're going to, have to accept. There's a great question on a survey that says, do you go on holiday to the same place every year or somewhere new every year? That is very correlated with your views on immigration. Because, again, if you love change, if you have a taste for it, you're probably going to be more open to diversity as well and immigration. And if you actually prefer stability and order and continuity, then you're not. And I think we are going to have to come to an accommodation between these two groups of people. And I think to demonize one people and say, if you just prefer your old routines and you go to the same place on holiday and you want things to stay the same, you're an awful person. I just think going down that road is just going to lead to the divisions we see, not just in the US, by the way. Canada's having an election. These divisions have emerged in the last 5 years very sharply. Europe, Britain, where I live, divided. So I think this is a big problem for our time, and I think we need to accept. Each side has to accept the other. So for populist conservatives to say people who want more immigration are globalist traitors is equally reprehensible to saying people who want less change are deplorable racists. I think we got to get away from that very binary discussion to the shades of gray in the middle. That's my view.
Thank you so much. So before opening it up for questions, I have one more question, but I should remind our audience to please join us for this discussion. And we will have 2 microphones that will make their way to the very front of the room. And so if you have questions, please feel free to start lining up. And just one final question for this fabulous panel. So we have another session this afternoon about immigration or migration and higher education. And thinking about the discussion that we've had, there have been a lot of, I think, really complex issues that we've had an opportunity to tease out. And I wonder about the extent to which we get the opportunity to do this enough in society, and whether our policymakers get the opportunity to have this type of counsel as they're thinking about how to solve these challenges. So I'd love to hear if you have thoughts about just the role of higher education in fostering these types of discussions, or even our capacity as various, segments of society to do this kind of work.
You go.
You go on that.
Well, no, I think there are some, a number. I think higher education absolutely has to be having these discussions, and it's great that Duke's doing this. I think that's very innovative. And I very much commend Noah and everybody else in doing this. And I was at an event in Bard College, which was sort of getting at the same thing, but they are rare. I mean, there are not that many of them because it's not easy to have some of these conversations, right? So I think, universities just have to keep on doing it the way Duke is doing it.
Yeah, I'll just say I think these conversations are very good. I think policymakers should be more a part of it. I think hearing from different points of views is good. I think as a general matter, way too many of us are living in silos, and there's just no communication. I was talking to one of your colleagues last night, and then we'll go to the Q&A from the audience, but it's a story which I try and remember because I'm susceptible to falling into this as anybody else. It's a story about C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield, who were part of a group called the Inklings. Lewis was one of the great Christian apologists in the 20th century, wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. And Owen Barfield was a British philosopher and poet. And they were part of this literary group that Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien put together called the Inklings. Lewis, in his book Surprised by Joy, talked about two different kinds of friends. He said there are first friends and second friends. The first friend is the friend who is your alter ego. That's the person where if you begin the sentence, the other person can complete it. You see the world the same way. You reinforce each other. We all need that. That's what part of what human community is about. He said the second friend is the person who's not your alter ego, is not your alter ego, but your anti-self. That's the person, he said, who reads the same books you do and draws all the wrong conclusions from them. And he has this passage, it's about halfway through Surprised by Joy, where he's talking about Owen Barfield, who was his second friend. Arthur Greaves was a person who, in this case, he was his first friend from his childhood. And he said, Owen and I used to go at it. They were friends, but they had this very intense esoteric debate about the role of truth and imagination in literature. And Lewis says, you know, we went at it, Owen and I, hammer and tong, late into the night, arguing, feeling the power of each other's blows, almost unconsciously beginning to absorb what the other person was saying. And out of this dogfight became a community of affection. And the punchline of this is that both Lewis and Barfield treasured their friendship precisely because they saw the world in a different way. And they felt like that they could see things together that they wouldn't see apart, that the fact that they had a different perspective widened the aperture of truth. And Barfield said later that when Lewis and I would debate, we didn't debate for victory, we debated for truth. And that's just an entirely different way of approaching those matters. And I think university campus is probably preeminently the place where people should debate for truth rather than victory.
All right, well, thank you very much. And let's open it up for questions. So we'll start on the right.
So thanks so much for the observations. So I have a quick comment and a question. So my comment is about the history. I'm an historian, so bear with me just for a sec. About the history of immigration policy, but particularly refugee policy. And just to, I think, observe what is actually a commonality between the left and the right today, which is that the kind of historical origins of what Peter, you said, of the United States being a kind of refugee leader, is that refugee law exists squarely between foreign policy and immigration law and humanitarian interests, so that the refugee expresses both a national interest and a humanitarian interest. And even if you want to transcend those, Michael, as a matter of law, that's how and why the United States became this magnet, because throughout the Cold War, we used refugee law to bring in defeated allies, whether they were Hungarians, whether they were Cuban, whether they were Vietnamese, in numbers that were far beyond what any authorization was. And they used the parole authority, they used the executive branch, actually different branches of government collaborated to find ways to bring in hundreds of thousands of refugees. What is interesting at this moment is that humanitarian and national are totally bifurcated on both sides. So that the left argues for the humanitarian interest in refugees, and the right argues that the refugee is an anathema to the national interest. And we see it right now. There is no call today to help Kurdish refugees. This would have been completely antagonistic to the history of how American power has worked in the post-war period, where a historic ally is basically being abandoned in a foreign policy theater. So that the question about Kurdish refugees is really interesting. There is no foreign policy national interest being articulated to defend them. It is purely humanitarian. So here's my question. Accepting the duality of refugee law, how would you think about restoring the sweet spot between humanitarian and national? And that might be hard for you, Michael.
Yeah.
But like, just for the sake of the argument, what would the argument be that would try to reestablish an overlap between the humanitarian and the national interest in refugees? Because I think that is actually a missed opportunity that the left is not even seeing. Another way of putting it, the person I would respond to, Stephen Miller, I would tell him that he's addicted to liberal moral outrage, and it blinds him to seeing the history of the national interest in immigration. He actually doesn't know the history very well, and I teach it. He did not take my class, but I'm being arrogant. Okay, that's my question.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, I think what's gone on partly is that the national identity of the country, as espoused by conservatives, has shifted from what we call missionary nationalism based on service to a universal, which might be capitalism and liberal democracy against communism. That's communist foe is gone, and so that means that those universalist missionary registers of nationalism have been replaced by what I would see as a more European-style particularistic nationalism. And within that particularistic nationalism, there's much less of an incentive to admit refugees for nationalistic reasons. I guess that's how I would explain the shift. And in a way, this represents the kind of Europeanization of the American right. It's actually become much more familiar to a European conservative. They recognize Trump as, he's not hard to understand, whereas George W. Bush was impossible for a European conservative to understand.
I'll come from the left instead and say, I don't know how much we want to emphasize those nationalist interests as much with the Kurds. I see totally why, but if I think about the Cold War, where Cubans were being allowed in and Central Americans weren't, I don't know if that's the rhetoric that I want to be promoting.
Policy was inconsistent.
Yes.
But it brought in millions of people.
It did.
So no to the Kurds.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I wonder whether sometimes using a rhetoric of nationalism or actually hinders another type of rhetoric of inclusion. Saying like, we want these people because they're in our national interest means we don't want those. And is sort of how one rhetoric bolsters a rhetoric of non-inclusion as well. I'd be careful about that.
I'd say that I think that's a fair concern to have. I do think that you need both as a matter of sort of the ethic of responsibility. You've got to explain to the public why the policy you're pursuing is not simply humane, but also in the national interest. And if you get one without the other, it's going to suffer. So I think as a general matter, if it's just a humanitarian appeal, and there are exceptions here, but as a general matter, if it's just humanitarian appeal, and that's one that I'm susceptible to, I don't think that that's politically nearly as powerful. And so if you're talking about the actual outworking of these things, as opposed to just the emotive aspect of it, the actual outworking of it, I think wise policymakers will find a way to connect those two so people can come away from it saying, okay, I get it. It's in my interest and it's the right thing to do. I think that's the most powerful combination.
I also have a question back. Like, isn't it a way of defending U.S. foreign policy, and is that what you want to be doing?
So
Sorry.
I would just say that people like Frederick Douglass
Yes.
didn't give the nation away. And I think that's part of what the tension is on the left regarding human rights. It is to use the nation. So I think that's the dilemma on the left. And I would argue for a more vigorous embrace of the nation around refugee questions and humanitarian questions.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, thank you for your
Yeah, do a
commentary.
little louder. I think.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
That's good.
Okay,
yes.
cool. I just wanted to ask, you don't seem to have a coherent definition of racism, so I would like to ask each of you what your definition is and what your idea of racism is, and then how does that factor into this debate of immigration and borders?
Thank you.
Was it to me? Okay.
Well, it could be.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I would define. Yeah, I would define racism as sort of a sense of superiority, feelings that your race is superior to another, or hating, or resenting an outgroup. On the one hand, so it has to be sort of hostility to the other, or an obsession with race purity or race essentialism for your own group, or it could be that you're not either of those things, but you're willing to discriminate in favor of your own race in violation of someone's right to equal treatment. So that's sort of how I would define it, how I define racism, yeah.
I guess I would define racism in a more abstract way, as seeing race as an essential quality in someone and not something that was socially constructed on them. That's something that comes because of the structures of society. And as a result, not seeing also how people behave different, have been treated differently, are in economically different positions because of these constructions that exist that at different times have been meaningless.
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent moderation. Coming from not a history but a human rights perspective, just a comment and a quick question. We already have 70 million refugees in camps. I don't think we need more camps. I don't think that's a solution. I think that's already a failed response. But less than 100,000 refugees are resettled annually. So, and that's entirely voluntary. There's no refugee treaty requirement that anyone take refugees. So I just would point that out, that we've already got lots of camps and it's not working. Question on, Gunther kind of stole my Stephen Miller question, but I do think there is a serious question about the role of education in all this. If we have, I don't know personally, but I seriously doubt that Donald Trump crafted this policy. I think it was Stephen Miller, who's a graduate of this university. And I do think that raises questions. I don't want to take too many inferences from that, but I do think it raises a serious question about the role universities play beyond an excellent forum like this. I don't think raising awareness is solving the problem. So I would challenge us to think a little bit deeper on that, and maybe this afternoon is the place for that. But I had a more specific question about evangelicals, and I would specify white evangelicals. And I just wonder, maybe this is more for Peter. I don't think quoting scripture at people is creating understanding, because everyone can quote scripture, and white evangelicals still have the position that they have, which may be antithetical to what you think the scripture means, but certainly isn't apparently to them. And I'm just wondering what you think. I have a white evangelical friend who is absolutely distraught at what's going on now in Syria, and has deep connections to Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was a North Carolinian, who has been cited a lot by the president as having been saved. At least in North Carolina, white evangelicals are extremely distraught by what's going on. Yet their leadership, and in particular their political leadership, is not. What the heck is going on?
Yeah. It's a simple question. Yeah, I'll say a couple things. It's a good question. I just to be clear, I don't think just quoting scripture. Well, Shakespeare said the devil can quote scripture for his own purposes. I do think it actually matters if you're an evangelical Christian. It may not matter to them. It does matter to me. That is, if I'm trying to think through for me what is a proper biblical ethic, that's one of the places I'm going to turn. And I also wouldn't underestimate, since this is the world that I live in terms of community, Bible studies and so forth, that there are people who are of the Christian faith, white evangelicals, where that matters. And so if you're going to actually make a biblical case, it does matter to have some degree of biblical literacy. I don't think by any means that that's sufficient in and of itself. I actually think that what's crucial here are human relationships. That is the ability, person by person, to have access and standing in somebody's life so you can make these arguments. Because if I, as a stranger, say it to somebody, Eric was talking earlier about psychology. We know what psychology says, and you know what your own human experience says, which is they're going to get angry at you, and they're probably going to dig in their heels more. In terms of more broadly, what's going on? I mean, I will say that's of all of the stuff politically that's happening, that's for me the most personally painful thing, because this is a faith that I care about, and it's complicated. I would say if you talk to white evangelicals, it's very important to distinguish. This is not Latinos. It's not African American evangelicals. And you said, what is it that explains this, what I would refer to as unholy alliance with Donald Trump? Give me your best case. Let me listen to what you have to say. I think what they would say, what they have said to me in some version is, we're in an existential moral moment, that the left has a deep contempt for us, and they want to bend us to see the world the way they do, see Beto O'Rourke, with tax-exempt status for churches if they don't agree with him on same-sex marriage. And if they get power, bad things are going to happen to us and bad things are going to happen to the country because they think that they're conservatives, and so they think conservative policies are better for the common good. And we have to stop them. And Donald Trump is the person that we have at this moment in time to stop them. And so we have to support him. I don't agree with that argument. I understand it. Where I think the real indictment of white evangelicals, and I'm too sweeping because it's a huge group, it's 25% of the country virtually, and there are a lot of gradations here. But as a general matter, let me just say, at least as a white evangelical leadership, the indictment is that they don't speak truth to power. What they seem completely incapable of doing is saying, on the one hand, we agree with your policy or we agree with your Supreme Court nominee. On the other hand, the way that you're acting, the crudity, the cruelty, the dehumanization of others, the illegality, the unethical behavior is wrong. And the same standard that we used, say, when Bill Clinton was president, just to choose an arbitrary person, and used a moral 2x4 upside the head when he was president, we're not going to throw those standards out now that Donald Trump, our guy, is in and say, you know what, King David did bad things too, so who are we to judge? Those are exactly the arguments that the Clinton people made in the 90s where the white evangelicals were saying, that's not going to fly. And that, I think, and I will say that this is on both sides. I know feminists, I remember the feminists who defended Bill Clinton's sexual predatory behavior, which was established beyond a question of a doubt. And they said, as long as he keeps abortion legal, go to it. And now, all of a sudden, sexual predatory behavior matters. So I'm not saying that this is limited only to white evangelicals or conservatives. But I think that what has happened is this power. I did a piece most recently in the New York Times, and I'll be quiet here, but it's called The Psychology of Accommodation. Because to me, what was interesting and to some degree frightening is if you even watch the arc of the Trump presidency and Republicans who several years ago were at least willing to call Trump out, whether it was John McCain on the POWs or Judge Curiel, or even in Charlottesville and some other incidents, they no longer have done that on these issues. And so they've accommodated themselves to that. And I think that they've gone in violation of their integrity. And I think that is bad for politics. I think it's bad for Christian evangelicals. I think it's bad for the Christian witness. But I think what's driving it, as best I can tell from the conversations I have had, is a lot of fear which is transmuted into anger.
Thank you. Right over here.
So I'm kind of curious to ask the more left side of the panel. Professor Michael, you privilege the idea of individual agency of immigrants or refugees themselves, and we've heard, we've raised suspicions whether efforts at cultural conservatism that would restrict, is that inherently racist because you're suggesting there's an other that's coming in and the change is threatening. But there must be edge cases, right, where people organize to restrict movement in or migration in to preserve their own otherness, right? I mean, European nationalists have adopted the rhetoric of diversity and preservation of themselves. And I mean, on the very extreme end, an individual Han Chinese person might have great incentives, actually does have great incentives now, to internally migrate to the Xinjiang province. And should we just say to Uyghurs, like, well, you can't oppose them. He has good incentives. He has agency, incented by the government. You should just accept that, it might link up to a government pogrom against you, but you don't actually have a legitimate interest. I mean, at some point, like, at some point a Uyghur may have like a legitimate moral interest in stabbing someone who's coming in there to destroy their culture and wipe it off the face of the earth, right? Like, which groups get to defend themselves, which groups don't collectively?
I'm puzzled by your analogy, but
Well, but I'm saying that's the extreme end. But I mean, you could find someone,
Right.
you could find an ethnic group or, a small European nation that could easily be overwhelmed. They built these nation states in order to preserve their rights and power, right? Often breaking out of empires to do so. But those can be lost again. Some of them will be. So at what point does a majority actually become an endangered other along the scale? There must be somewhere where it does.
So there are a couple things. I mean, first with the discussion about race or racism and migration, what I was pointing to at the beginning of it was just that there is a coincidence, and it's worth interrogating, between a rise of racism in various forms in North America and Europe and questions about migration. Not just that. I mean, rise of racism in a variety of things with regard to migrants and not. So it's not just that there's a complete overlap between racism and migration, but that what we've seen is a rise in anti-migrant rhetoric and racism in both contexts, which seems to be worth thinking about together. I mean, maybe the first thing to say about the analogies you're making is about, like, you're posing different examples of the destruction of community. And so you're posing the analogy between the fears of the dominant and how the subordinated might ruin their community, and then the fears of the subordinated, who I think are already being, that you don't need migration to subordinate them. So the connection between, I don't know, maybe it was like Liechtenstein and the Uyghurs in Western China that were.
Well, no, it's not like I'm saying they're not equivalent, but there is a scale. There is a scale between dominance and subjection, and groups pass through those or occupy different parts of them in relation to other groups and cultures.
Right.
Right. So like that's, and what I mean, it's one of the things that scrambles
Okay.
everyone on debates about Israel. Right. Is Israel the product of a defense against genocidal violence, or is it a product of a project of genocidal violence? Right. I mean, that's why people continually mess it up. But there is some scale. That's
certainly a complicated example too. I'm not sure I'm understanding the scale part, but
well,
maybe
you're saying
maybe
there's dominant and there's a subjected peoples,
right?
But those aren't always clear, and they do change over time.
But maybe the important thing here, like that might be going, is that I'm not sure that movement and mobility is really and should be the determining factor here. Like that, so that the fact of restricting mobility and movement is the object of defending community seems to me not necessarily the right way of conceiving it. Like that's the way what you're posing is that in order to defend community, we have to fend off others, put up walls, keep them out, and I don't think that's true. And also, then there is the other thing about the.
But there are extreme ends where it obviously would be true, right? Like, especially when you're in a subject position, right? Like if you're the Kurds, right? Mm-hmm. Kurds are often in violent relations with the nations they're spread out in, right? Because they're a subjected people.
I mean, just
go ahead. I'm a little bit missing it.
Okay, so for example, I think what Michael's getting at is, for example, if you take Native Indian reservations, they're allowed to regulate who's allowed to live on the reserve and who's eligible for membership, which is often based on a certain percentage of Native ancestry. Or, for example, places like American Samoa and the Marshall Islands are allowed to regulate migration, again, to protect their particular cultures. And I think the question here is that inherently racist? And by the way, we should also say...
That's not the question, is it?
I think it is.
Well, it is the question. Does it meet your definition? Does it meet your definition?
The last 5 minutes, so if it's okay, I wonder
we can continue it.
During lunch.
Does it meet
And
the
if we
definition
could
of
go
racism?
and get these 3 student questions in a row, we can take all of them at once. And then let's see if we can enter the lightning round and see if we can get all of the remaining questions.
Okay, I'm just going to take it out because I am too short for this. Thank you to the panelists. One of my biggest frustrations, I think, with American politics today is that it seems like a lot of people are much more afraid of being called a racist than racism. And so I'm wondering, when we're talking about immigration and re-inspiring this mutually beneficial narrative, how do we do so in a way that doesn't create more racial animus than already exists? Do we need to remove racism from the conversation? And if that is the case, how can we have an honest dialogue about this issue?
Thank you so much. Next question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. A lot of the times I see people who advocate for more restrictive immigration control saying something along the lines of illegal immigrants should just come here legally, right? My own immigrant parents say the same thing like over and over, and I'm like, what? And I would just and then I go and look at the numbers, and I feel like legal immigration numbers are dropping every year, especially in this administration, through decreased refugee quotas as well as other mechanisms. People just come here legally, whether that's through green cards, et cetera. Why is that happening? So why do we see a decrease in legal immigration numbers, and how does that reveal something about the true motivation of what people want in terms of the number of immigrants coming to this country?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And third question?
Hi, thank you all for doing this. I was unfortunately late. I had math class, but I just, speaking as an 18-year-old in the modern day where, I can go on Twitter or watch streams or whatever. I don't have to open a newspaper or turn on TV to see anything. I can hear and see a lot of platitudes being spread about immigration where we have to change the narrative, we have to change public opinion. There has to be some sort of change. I think I heard someone here talk about the dangers of populism and what that's doing. And there's an interesting comparison for you to kind of call the question of immigration the modern day Jefferson's fire bell in the night, where the wolf that we have at its horns now is our border that we have to let go of. Yeah. But I guess my question, just speaking as a young person, where it's hard to see concrete things, what does it look like when we let that wolf go? What does it look like when you let go of that stable border and trying to actually create that change? What's the action behind that?
Thank you very much. So could we try to tackle those three very quickly, and then we'll also try to make it to the final two questions.
Oh, well, okay, I will, just on the racism one, yeah, I think it's very important with racism. There is real racism, and I just mentioned a couple of Trump statements which fit that description. I think it's very important for us to be forensic in our definition of racism and not let it creep outward to include all kinds of things, including cutting taxes and and even talking about restricting numbers of immigrants. So I think it's very important to have that clear definition and show how it applies. And there's so for me, there's a very big difference between insinuating that Mexicans are all rapists and wanting a border wall. Whatever the motivation in wanting a border wall, it is not in the same category as the first. And I think we need to start making those distinctions.
Yeah, just echo that. I certainly wouldn't remove that and say that we shouldn't call things that are racist, or if there's racism, not to mention it, because it exists. You just have to be prudent and judicious in the use of it. You shouldn't overuse it. And I'd say that as a general matter with public discourse today, I'd say that the problem isn't that we're not calling each other enough names. I think it's the other problem, actually, which is that we're not hearing and listening to other people from different perspectives better. It doesn't mean that they're not wrong. It doesn't mean that you're going to change their mind. It just means that we have to be able to listen to where people are coming from. And at least in my own experiences here, I've gotten a lot farther with people when I've actually taken the time to listen to them, or vice versa. And the fact is, you also ultimately have more leverage with them. If you look at it just from an instrumental standpoint, if you want them to try and move them or to hear an argument that you have to say, they have to feel like they're not under attack all the time. And we have to find, as a general matter, more broadly, the kind of rhetoric that is able to make arguments of conviction and passion, but are also decent and fair.
And any final thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to really echo the comment about legal immigration. The number of immigrants who are allowed into the country has fallen, and it's not necessarily static. Like, we could change that very easily. And so if we want to reduce undocumented migration, we could change the number of refugees that are allowed in. We could allow more immigrants to come a legal way, and this has been debated over time.
So I'm so sorry that we have reached the end of our time. I feel like we could discuss these issues with this amazing panel all day. I hope that those of you who have additional questions will find time to pull our panelists aside throughout the day and to engage in further conversation. But I guess in the meantime, I hope you'll join me in thanking this amazing panel.